Welcome to week 3. We are talking about policy actors and beginning to look at the ways in which policy actors make decisions either to act or not act, because that is a policy decision in and of itself. So we're going to be talking about some early theories of policy behavior and maybe talking about the ways in which they are insufficient in terms of describing our world, or the ways in which they've continued into the research agenda of some policy scholars. So let's get started. So, in order to understand the things that we're going to talk about today, I think a good first step is to discuss the kind of overall problem dealing with issues that involve collective action. And some of you may remember this from your economics classes or some other sort of policy or political classes, but the general idea with collective action problems is that when goods are public, when they are public goods, we have trouble providing for those goods in an efficient way. Public goods represent collective action problems because public goods benefit everyone. Some goods, when they are made available by one person, can be consumed by everybody at no additional marginal cost. So you can't just price them at zero if everybody benefits. However, that's essentially what a lot of people end up paying because they don't contribute. They don't contribute to their creation and they don't contribute to their maintenance. And you can't exclude people from truly public goods. So the kind of common definition of collective action problems, and I'm going to post a video on Blackboard just outlining collective action problems more generally and broadly, is that is the notion of an open field, right, where cows go to graze. And if every farmer has their cow go graze there, it's no longer a good field for grazing, but it's no one's to upkeep, so everybody just lets their cows overgraze. We have a lot of things, especially in public policy, that are collective action problems because they are public goods. And probably the easiest one to understand is the notion of clean air or clean water, right? Especially clean air. Everybody benefits from clean air. You can't exclude people. If the air is completely clean, if you've solved all of the pollution problems, you can't say, well, stop breathing. You don't deserve to breathe this air. So providing it means that someone has to pick up the costs, knowing that not everybody will contribute to the creation of that public good. So it's costly, the benefits go to everyone, you can't exclude people from things like roads or having clean air, and so many free ride on the work of others. And by doing so, the public good is diminished because parties are worse off than if everybody contributed to the public good. In other words, some people have to work more, others don't contribute at all and yet take advantage of it. So they may actually diminish what is available. And the tragedy that commons is the notion that people overconsume the shared good, or the common pool resource, as some of the theories call it, and no one invests in it, and then the shared good fails. So overcoming this public good problem is very important for public policy entrepreneurs. So this week, we're not just talking about common pool resources or public goods, and we're not just talking about their problems, but we're talking about actors and how they act. So we're really talking about decision making. And decision making processes are notoriously complicated. If you've ever taken a psychology class, you know that. And decision making processes within institutions and a historical framework are complicated by all of those factors as well. So we'll talk about a couple of ways in which policy scholars have attempted to explain the actions of policymakers and policy actors. And we'll also talk about maybe the limitations of those things along the way. One of the first concepts that your reading tackles, and the one that I wanted to start to kind of illuminate first, is this notion of bounded rationality. So here you see this meme with Lisa telling Mr. Burns that you're still unrealistic, and when you're trying to be realistic, you're even more unrealistic. Someone in here has labeled it critic talking to economist. Rationality is an a concept from economics. And rationality basically says, without going too far down the rabbit hole, but just enough so we can understand it, that people will act in a way that betters their position, essentially. And bounded rationality, which started with Simon and then picks up with Lindblom, and your reading talks about those different iterations, is basically the idea that people cannot be completely rational. They cannot be completely rational because it's impossible for humans, and policy actors are humans, to be completely rational. They lack certain information to be able to weigh the costs and benefits that a completely rational actor would do. Because if you were completely rational, you would have all the information, you would weigh the costs and benefits of a certain course of action, you would pick that course of action that is least costly and most beneficial. So you'd find that optimal point, and you are always acting in your best interests. But complete rationality, especially in public problems, is not possible. That's because rationality requires complete knowledge, and people don't have complete knowledge, and they especially don't have knowledge of the consequences that follow from any given choice they might make. So in practice, the knowledge of consequences, the knowledge of the situation is always temporary. That being the case, because this knowledge is temporary and because rationality requires complete knowledge, we have to imagine what might happen and we have to attach value to it. And so our values can only be imperfectly anticipated. We can only take a guess as to what might happen, maybe based on past information that may or may not be true, or on guesses. And because rationality requires us to choose between all possible alternatives and have all that knowledge, it's just not possible to be completely rational for human beings and certainly policy actors related to public policy. So decisions in public policy still have some rationality to them, Simon says, and Lindblom also agrees. Simon, Lindblom, and others argue that decisions can be explained as being made within what is called bounded rationality. So because humans tend to be rational, we tend to weigh the costs and benefits and act in our own self-interests. But we have cognitive limitations. We tend to act in what is called bounded rationality, those bounds being how much information we actually have. So the information is incomplete, and what we are doing is really finding what is good enough. Simon called this satisficing. This is allowing policymakers to make the best decision given the situation. So we need to talk about rationality in two ways here. One is substantively what is rational in terms of the actual policy, but the other, which actually concerns people studying bounded rationality a bit more, is procedurally. How are people procedurally making decisions? Bounded rationality is a procedural method that, given all the information that is known, including past practice, allows policymakers to rely on shortcuts to make decisions. Instead of having to start fresh with every new policy, with every new iteration of a policy, policymakers can relate new problems to old ones and determine what the best course of action is based on what has been done before. Now, Lindblom also added the idea that policymakers don't really start fresh every time. Instead, they do what he called muddling through, and they make small changes to existing policies rather than kind of remaking the policy framework every time. That's because of two things. One are these cognitive restraints that Simon said were there, and the other are situational constraints. There actually might be more imagination than bounded rationality maybe gives credit for, but there are other situational constraints that make it such that small incremental changes are really how policy gets made. This allows us to act more quickly as policy actors because you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. When you know that you have a policy problem that looks like something you've dealt with before, you can kind of pick up cues on what went well and what didn't and make a policy that looks somewhat substantially similar. Now, this is called branch policymaking as opposed to root policymaking. In other words, we're not starting from the roots up, we're merely changing how the branches reach different policy matters. So, decision making on successive limited comparisons is actually an efficient way, these scholars argue, to make policies. This is not a bad way to go. This is actually a very smart way to go because it is efficient and it uses all of the information we have at our disposal. Now, bounded rationality is a theory, but it's also kind of underlies some other theories as well, that humans don't have perfect information. That's kind of a given, right? And that we can only act on what we have is also a given. But you'll see throughout the course of this semester that a lot of these theories about the policy process and how we can explain policy making really comes back to this idea of incremental change and how do we explain incremental change. Some people would claim that that's how we've set up the framework around it in terms of narrative, or maybe we're afraid of radical change. But bounded rationality is an explanation that says we're not afraid of it, and this isn't even sociological in terms of what language we've given it. It's just what we know is possible, and we're making the best decisions on the information available to us. Now, getting back to the meme you see over there, the economic concept of rationality means we're only being rational when we are acting with perfect information and we're making cost-benefit analyses that benefit ourselves. So a lot of people find that kind of hard to adhere to. And we're going to talk in a minute about public choice because it's just inconceivable that everybody's acting in their best interests or collectively the best interests. So bounded rationality is usually attacked as being, somewhat limited in its scope. And public choice kind of adds on to this notion a little bit and says that citizens should be given choices about their public services and their costs. So again, we're talking about a free market range of services that you might be entitled to, things like fire service, police service, trash disposal, etc. And that when given these quasi-market forces, this choice about their public services and their costs, governments should supply or will supply the demanded services efficiently. But we know that small, centralized governments are actually bad at providing public goods in an efficient way. When you have different small localities, they only have certain types of economies of scale and just cannot make good on all the efficiencies that might otherwise exist. And it's hard to say that citizens have a choice when really the choice that ends up existing is whatever the municipality says you get, right? So Tybalt added another element to this, which kind of flips it a little bit on its head. We're still talking about rational people, and we're still talking about rational decisions here. And that's kind of the theme for this week, is rational decision making. But it's also a little bit of incremental decision making and status quo. And so what Tybalt said is that the primary objective of any community is to provide citizens good services, whether that's water, police protection, etc. And that centralized or consolidated communities are actually inefficient in doing this. Why? Because you can't really divide them down to the individual level, even though we might be charged individually for water service or trash service, and we certainly have taxes down to the property level. The provision of goods is actually left to a centralized structure, and that centralized structure has a monopoly over what you can get. You can't write a note to your city council person and say, I actually prefer to have my garbage picked up by Waste Management, not Green for Life, right? You don't get that choice. And so when you don't get that choice, market theorists and public choice theorists would argue that you can't actually act efficiently, because efficiently means that you would get to pick the one that's best for you. So these centralized systems then aren't that responsive to citizen preferences. So centralized governments are bad at providing public services, and people can't choose their own services. But Tybalt said they could choose where to live based on the services that are provided. So people can essentially move with their feet or vote with their feet. And the idea here is that there is some efficiency that was not previously thought about in public choice because people can choose to move, and choosing to move or threatening to move makes municipalities responsive to citizen needs because they might otherwise risk losing population and a tax base. So, another economic theory, and it's all perfect and tied up in a bow, and everything becomes more efficient, right? Well, there are problems with this theory or criticisms of it. One is that it kind of leaves entirely to the side the role of democratic activities, of voting, of citizen participation, how those things work in this system really is not relevant to the system itself because it's merely about either people choosing to live somewhere or not. And that kind of takes out a whole host of activities that can and do happen at the local level. But another problem with this theory is that there's mixed evidence about whether this is what happens or not. People's choice to live somewhere, or their choices to live somewhere or not live somewhere, are much more complicated than the types of services that are provided. You know, people move for a whole host of reasons, and they stay in places for a whole host of reasons, some of which might actually be kind of a feedback about the services they're getting, but some of which might not. People, move for reasons that have nothing to do with the municipality itself. So this kind of doesn't explain behavior in a fully satisfactory way, and it really leaves out the things about public policy that make it truly public. Now, one more before we kind of compare them and talk about them more broadly and kind of think about what this adds to our knowledge. And that is the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework, or IAD. And this was spearheaded by Eleanor Ostrom out of Indiana. And this is kind of your basic bounded rationality plus. And so you can think about it as adding the role of institutions to the mix. And she and her kind of I don't want to say followers, but the people who studied under her and those who take up IAD argue that there is bounded rationality. But in addition to that, we have to think about how institutions shape preferences. Because people don't act as single actors on one-shot problems and then move on to the next one, but that institutions actually work to shape preferences themselves. And so the way in which institutions are formed, how they function, what their limitations are very relevant to the discussion as well. And that second, people use institutions to solve collective action problems. In other words, it's not just citizens voting to some unmanned computer in the sky about whether they want services or not. It's people interacting with institutions, whether that be a city council or a city commission, a mayor or a city manager, county commission or a county executive. People actually interact with institutions, and institutions have their own sets of preferences and goals and points of efficiency and inefficiency. And so they argued that this IAD framework is useful for policy analysts in explaining and predicting how people will respond to institutional rules and institutional actions. So what they said is that there's a feedback loop. And this feedback loop revolves around what they call the action situation. The action situation are the social spaces where individuals interact, exchange goods and services, solve problems, dominate one another, or fight, among the many things that individuals do in action situations. In other words, those are the places where things take place. And action situations, or institutions, which is really the shortcut here, are influenced by a set of external variables. And those can include a myriad of things about how the social world works. And so you have the external variables influencing the action situation, and the action situation affecting the interactions and outcomes of individuals and of policies, and both of which are affected by evaluative criteria. So outcomes serve as a feedback function affecting external variables and the action situation. In other words, the policies that are developed influence future policies. The problem with the theory, if you haven't caught on yet, is that it is enormously complex, and many critics, I would count myself amongst them, find it to be a little more complicated than is probably necessary to really effectively study policy making. The purpose of IAD is to describe and explain outcomes that result from human interaction, and they really want to focus on the role of institutions. But the way in which the theory has kind of evolved requires kind of a lot more technical knowledge than is probably helpful in understanding public policy and why or why not certain things happen. And so the the theory itself or the framework itself might be helpful in pinpointing the role of institutions, but a lot of people have rejected it as kind of a grand theory of policy, actors, and behavior because it is so complicated and it seems to almost overcomplicate the matter a little bit. It really is kind of a theory that builds off of bounded rationality, though, and really focuses in on institutions. And that what I would give to you as kind of the takeaways for IAD. So in comparison, I kind of want to draw us out of each of these three and kind of give you some ways in which to kind of recall and understand what is going on here. These three kind of buckets, bounded rationality, public choice, and also the tie-bout model, and then IAD, are ways in which to look at public policy as the end result of some sort of rational decision-making process. And they're all bound to the idea that humans are rational actors and that they act rationally within certain boundaries, namely that they don't have perfect information. So some of the key things that come out of this is that people have limited cognitive abilities and use shortcuts and really, and this is important here, previous ways of doing things to govern themselves. They don't always go for the new big flashy thing because they're afraid of it. In fact, they might actually like it, but instead they kind of use what has been done and tweak it to new situations or apply it to new situations because that is actually a rational thing to do because you have more information about it. So it's a series of shortcuts and doing things that is useful to you. Public choice adds on to this that the individual choice really influences where people live, and in turn, that might influence what services are provided by municipalities or provided by other kinds of public actors. The notion that people choose where they live, and that is what makes a sort of public choice or, public good market effective or efficient is really at the heart of this. And then IAD agrees, again, with this limited cognitive ability, but says that institutions play a role to shape how people behave and how policy decisions are made. All of these center around the status quo, people being rational, at least with the information they're given, and the notion that we don't make large policy changes kind of willy-nilly, but that we use kind of incremental change as we go. So relating this back to the notion of net neutrality should be a fairly interesting concept. So the discussion question this week that I'd like to pose to you is this. Is net neutrality, is the net neutrality issue one that is governed by past practices and policies? In one way, the idea is to regulate the internet like a utility, or as a utility, but the legislation that they're trying to kind of shoehorn the internet into doesn't cover the internet explicitly, and it certainly wasn't designed with the internet in mind. Is this kind of bounded rationality at work and is public choice a way out of it for everyday people? So let me explain my thought process behind this a little bit. Bounded rationality, as we've talked about, would assume that people are making decisions based on past practices and they're going to make limited steps, not large ones, to change things. Net neutrality, the basic underlying premise is whether we are going to treat the internet as a utility under the utility laws that we have for the Federal Communications Commission. We aren't talking about, at least right now, we're not talking about creating a whole new governmental structure of oversight for the internet that is not tied to any other currently existing law. We're talking about, should we interpret a law to cover the internet now that it exists? So it seems to me that there's an argument that could be made that bounded rationality is at play here, right? That people have chosen to kind of limit the scope of what we're doing because the status quo is known and we can measure the status quo and we can see how it is regulated, the rest of the telecommunications industry, and make choices based on that regulation. And if that's the case, how can we, as kind of everyday citizens, vote with our feet? If public choice means, and the tie-belt model means, that we can effectively voice our concern about some of these things by moving with our feet, how is that possible, especially when we live in areas with limited internet service providers? Some of this has been happening, right? The kind of idea that 5 years ago we would have had all these streaming services and kind of an a la carte system where we pick what we want to see, we would have laughed at a little bit, right? Because we were all much more tied to cable. We're still tied to the internet, but we've already broken that cable tie up a little bit. Is that something where market influences can change the way we behave with respect to internet service providers? Maybe instead of, kind of grounded cable or DSL, now we all switch to cellular, well, it's not even cellular, but mobile technology. And we use that instead. And somehow that influences the public policy at play here. I want you to think about those things a little bit and just kind of toy with these theories as we discuss net neutrality for our final week in the discussion circles. So go ahead and get those discussions started. I've really been enjoying what you've been putting in and trying to throw in a couple of questions here or there where I think it can add to the discussion. So that's it for this week.